Welcome to my channel. This is the second episode of week 2 updates of the Iran conflict. In this video, we'll examine the situation from Hormuz to the Gulf and see why Iran still owns the escalation ladder. After 2 weeks of war, one thing is becoming harder to ignore. The weaker side has not collapsed, and the stronger side has not imposed control. Iran took the initial blow, survived it, and is now showing that it still has multiple ways to raise the cost of the war for the US. This is why the real story of week 2 is not de-escalation, as it seemed. It is escalation and who controls it. And now we'll discuss two aspects of the escalation. So the first one is Iran has every reason not to de-escalate. And the second part is about what capabilities support Iran's escalation of the war. And let's first look at Iran has every reason not to de-escalate. So U.S. Israeli struck during negotiations twice. This is the first reason to make. Iran's first reason not to de-escalate is simple. From Tehran's perspective, negotiations did not prevent war. The opening U.S. Israeli strikes on February the 28th killed Supreme Leader, and Iranian officials in the line commentary now frame that as proof that talks can coexist with preparations for attack, rather than serve as a genuine off-ramp. The second reason for Iran not to de-escalate is that a weaker state cannot accept a pause that let the stronger side reset. So think about the case of Ukraine. It is the same logic. For the weaker player, a bad ceasefire can be more dangerous than continued resistance. The lesson Tehran is likely drawing is not that it should pause, but that any pause without hard guarantees would give the US and Israel time to reload, reposition, and strike again on better terms. That logic had also been echoed by the European leaders drawing comparisons to the broader post-2022 security environment, including Ukraine. And you should also take into account Iran had already paid a heavy fixed cost, meaning suffering the airstrikes of U.S.-Israeli collision in the beginning of the war. And now Iran having paid that fixed cost, Iran has every reason to sustain the war effort. And the third reason Iran not to de-escalate is that having swallowed the initial blow, Iran comes to its showtime. So the first week was about whether Iran could survive the opening shock, and it did. Week 2 answered the question, yes. U.S. intelligence reportedly assessed that Iranian government is not at immediate risk of collapse, while Iran has continued to retaliate through missiles, drones, Gulf infrastructure pressure, and disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, if Tehran believes it survived the hardest punch, this is exactly the stage where it would prefer to escalate cost for everyone else rather than back down. Because from now on, there are no longer prominent targets for U.S. Israeli to hit. So the coalition are facing a diminishing marginal returns of military operations, while Iran is the opposite. So why back down? Iran should keep fighting. The last reason is vengeance and holy war. So for the Shia axis, this war becomes a war of jihad, not a normal crisis to be managed. Once leadership decapitation, Holy Month symbolism, and regional mobilization all come together, the war is easier for Iran and its allied forces to frame as a religious and civilizational struggle, rather than a limited state dispute. Reporting from March the 12th shows that Iran's proxies in Lebanon and the IRGC publicly coordinating major attacks, while Iranian rhetoric has shifted towards a prolonged war of attrition. That kind of framing encourages endurance and sacrifice. And now we come to the question, so what kind of capability could support Iran moving up this escalation ladder? And I will conclude these capabilities into four of the following. First is about its control over Hormuz, the choke point. The second is that its ability to disrupt alternative routes. If the Hormuz were to be blocked by Iran, then countries like Saudi Arabia may use the Red Sea route to transport and export oil. But sadly, Iran also has a say on these alternative routes. The third, I would conclude it as the vulnerabilities of GCC monarchies themselves. And the fourth point is that Iran has a surprisingly good war endurance, unlike many would consider. So we'll look at them one by one. Iran has the capability to deny safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's first major escalation advantage is the Strait of Hormuz. It does not need to permanently close the strait or completely close the strait in a legal or absolute sense. It only needs to make passage dangerous, uncertain, and commercially intolerable. That alone is enough to disrupt shipping, drive up insurance costs, and shake global energy markets. Recent reporting says Iran has already laid naval mines in the strait. Commercial ships have been struck, and the waterways have been severely disrupted. By deploying mini submarine mines, for example, Iran can use mini submarines for covert operations in the shallow regional waters, including surveillance, infiltration, and potentially mine-related activity in a narrow and crowded maritime choke point like Hormuz. Even a limited NRC threat forces commercial traffic and naval escorts to operate far more cautiously. This matters because the objective is not naval dominance in the far sea in the conventional sense, but persistent uncertainty and disruption. Reopening the strait is hard precisely because Iran has prepared layered asymmetric tools for years. The second means to deny the strait is by laying sea mines. The sea mines are one of Iran's most effective tools because they're cheap, hard to clear quickly, and highly disruptive, even in small numbers. On March the 11th, Iran had laid about a dozen mines in the strait, while other reporting notes that even the perception of mined waters can paralyze traffic before any confirmed denotation occurs. That is exactly why mines are such a powerful escalation tool. They can stop shipping faster than they sink ships. The third tool is by deploying UUVs, UUVs, and USVs. So these are unmanned unmanned combat vehicles. So Iran can also use unmanned systems across three domains: UUVs on the water, USVs on the surface, and UAVs in the air. On March the 11th, explosive sea drones had already struck tankers in the Gulf, showing how unmanned maritime systems can threaten commercial shipping directly. At the same time, drone swarms remain useful for surveillance, harassment, and attacks on ships and coastal infrastructure. These systems are relatively cheap, scalable, and well suited to attritional disruption. There are other means, of course, for example, high-end weaponries like land-based ASMs, anti-ship missiles. Iran's coastal anti-ship missiles are another key layer of the threat. Although U.S. Israeli coalition had the air superiority over the southern coast, the mountainous terrain and the mobility of missile launchers could still pose a significant threat to the Persian Channel. The strait is narrow, and the geography favors the land-based denial systems. Missiles fired from the Iranian coast or even deep inside Iran's territory can threaten tankers, escorts, and naval staging areas without Iran needing to win a fleet-on-fleet battle. And worse for the United States, the coalition, and probably for the West, is that Iran possesses both capabilities to disrupt the Hormuz and to disrupt alternative routes. For example, you may want to export oil through the Red Sea route, and that could also be disrupted by the Houthis, so Iran's proxies. Even if Gulf states and shipping companies try to reroute flows, Iran and its proxies can still threaten the alternatives. And the first mean to do that is by threatening the Mandeb Strait through the Houthis. The Houthis can reopen the Red Sea front and threaten the strait, the southern gateway to the Suez Road. And the most careful wording here is not that the strait is already closed, but that it is vulnerable to renewed disruption. And we could still recall that back in the Biden administration era, the U.S. sent carrier strike groups to fight against the Houthis, and many years later, the Houthis still stands just near the Red Sea. And Wall Street Journal reported that Iran, through semi-official channels, warned that allied groups, including the Houthis, are on high alert and could escalate in ways that threaten the Mandeb Strait. The second is by striking the fallback hubs outside Hormuz. So other than the Red Sea route, there are ports in the country of Oman that could help export oil of the Gulf countries if they could manage to firstly send those oil on by land to that port. So Iran had already shown the ability to hit the ports and storage sites that become more important when Hormuz is unsafe. On March the 11th, oil storage facilities at Salalah port in Oman were hit and fuel tanks caught fire. It suspended operations linked to this port after the drone attack. This is strategically important because this sits outside Hormuz and gains value precisely when ships look for safer routing and bunkering options. In other words, Iran is not just threatening the choke point, it is also threatening the escape route. Moreover, many would ignore a fact that Iran actually is capable of essentially wiping out the monarchies of GCC. Yes, you heard it, wipe out. So the first means is by targeting oil production facilities. The GCC monarchies are rich, but their wealth is physically concentrated. The regimes sit on a small number of oil fields, refineries, export terminals, storage sites, and coastal logistics nodes. That concentration is a vulnerability in war. About 1.9 million barrels per day of Gulf refining capacity had already been shut by March the 10th, affecting Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Kuwait also declared force majeure and cut output as the conflict disrupted shipments. In other words, Iran does not need to destroy everything. It only needs to repeatedly hit enough energy nodes to turn rentier stability into systematic stress. The second means is by targeting desalination plants, and that is even more severe than the first one. So the second vulnerability is more substantial. Water. Gulf monarchies are not just oil states. Many are highly desalination dependent states. That means a successful campaign against desalination plants, power supply, or associated coastal infrastructure would not just hurt exports, it could directly threaten daily life in major urban centers. Even when recent reporting focuses more on ports, fuel storage, and shipping than on confirmed desalination strikes, the strategic implication is obvious. If Iran can already disrupt tankers, port fuel systems, and coastal logistics, then the same coastal concentration makes desalination infrastructure an exposed and politically sensitive target class. Reuters reporting on attacks and damage around Gulf shipping and ports underscores how narrow the margin of safety is for these coastal systems. And the third alternative is by targeting U.S. financial institutions and big techs. The third vulnerability is digital and financial. Iran has shown that escalation does not have to remain limited to oil and shipping. It can also target the American digital and financial footprint that underpins Gulf modernization and external confidence. The Financial Times reported that Iran struck Amazon Web Services data centers in the UAE and Bahrain, showing that the US-owned cloud infrastructure in the Gulf is now part of the battlefield. At the same time, Reuters reported that Iran had explicitly threatened the US and the Israeli-linked banking interest in the region, while the Citigroup evacuated 3 buildings in the UAE as a precaution. US banks were already on high alert for Iranian cyber attacks. The point is not just that Iran can hit oil, it can also hit the data, payment, and financial systems that make the GCC monarchies function as modern, globally connected rentier states. And you might wonder, why would Iran hit GCC countries hard? And the reason lies in that although GCC is not a direct enemy of Iran, it is a significant center of the petrodollar system. So it is important to US. So by hitting GCC, Iran is essentially undermining the US. And that is why GCC's vulnerability is crucially important at this stage. The last part of this video discusses Iran's capability to sustain its war efforts. And I tend to believe that Iran could sustain the war much, much longer than many observers could believe. And by cost-effective terms, I would even consider it more sustainable than Israel or the US. The first reason is that Iran has an industrial foundation with a vast pool of STEM graduates. In fact, Iran, you may not believe, although it's a theology, although it is an Islamic state, it has the third largest pool of STEM graduates around the world. Iran also retains a meaningful industrial base. It may be sanctioned, it may be damaged, but it is not a hollow state with no manufacturing capacity of its own. And that is crucially important for wartime economics. Iran is still exporting oil at near normal levels to the Strait of Hormuz using its shadow fleet, which means the regime still has access to revenue and logistics channels, even while much of its neighbors' exports are disrupted. Iran has spent decades building a large technically trained population that feeds its missile, drone, nuclear, engineering, and the industrial sectors. In a world of attrition, that matters, because systems do not sustain themselves. They must be repaired, redesigned, dispersed, and rebuilt by engineers, technicians, and scientists. The second reason of Iran's sustainability is IRGC's shadow economy. So the Revolutionary Guard does not depend only on the formal economy. Iran's war effort is supported by the shadow system of sanctions evasion, protected shipping, illicit trade, and off-book financial networks. Iran has continued moving roughly 1.1 to 1.5 million barrels per day through Hormuz during the war, largely via its sanctioned shuttle fleet, while Gulf neighbors' exports have been hit far harder. That is strategically important because it means Iran is not simply surviving under blockade, it is still monetizing the conflict through channels it is built precisely for this kind of confrontation. The shadow economy gives Tehran room to keep fighting even under extreme pressure. The third reason is possible Russian intelligence support. On Russia, the safest formulation is this: Iran may be benefiting from Russian strategic backing, and there are public claims of possible intelligence support, but this remains contested in open reporting. So that is the core argument. Iran does not need to defeat the United States or Israel in a conventional sense. It only needs to prove that it can keep widening the battlefield, keep raising the cost, and keep making every next step more dangerous than the last. If that remains true, that the week 2 may be remembered as the moment when the logic of this war became clear. Iran may be the weaker player, but it still owns the escalation ladder. While I was making this video, Washington escalated again. More Marines, more warships, and a direct strike on the Hog Island. But this only sharpens the real question. America can project more force, that is obvious. What is not obvious is whether more force can produce control rather than simply a bigger war and more cost and more casualties. And if the answer is no, then my conclusion still stands. Iran may be weaker, but it may still own the escalation ladder. And that's all for today's video. If you like this channel so far, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to support the growth of this new channel. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.